because a lot of times he would take me in the church van and he would take the seats out except for the very back row. And it was a 15-passenger van. And we went up to the Santa Rosa Plateau. He gets in the back of the van and he takes off all of his clothes. And he's sitting on the very back row. That's the only row of seats that's there. It's one long row. I'm sitting in the front passenger seat. And he's back there and he's taken all of his clothes off. And I'm like, what is happening? And so then he says, come back here and sit by me. Well, this is my assistant pastor. You don't disobey. With the IFB, if you even go, okay, that's disobedience. If you don't do it with a good attitude, you have disobeyed. If a staff member or a pastor tells you to go do something and you don't willingly do it with a smile, that is disobedience and you would be corrected.
Wow.
So I reluctantly get up and I go sit next to him. I knew I was going to get blamed. I did not think I would get all of the blame.
Hey, my name is Shalise Ansola, and this is Cults to Consciousness, where we discuss leaving high-demand religions or organizations and finding healing and independence through awareness and true individual sovereignty. If you're only listening and you want to see our faces, you can go to our YouTube channel at Cults to Consciousness, where you can subscribe, all the YouTubey things, help the algorithm, leave those words of encouragement for our guests who are bravely coming on and sharing their stories. They do read the comments. It means so much to them and to us that you would be willing to support us. So today's guest, we found her through the Let Us Pray documentary on HBO, or I guess it's called Max now, and it discusses the IFB, which is the Independent Fundamental Baptist Church. So we're going to get into what that means, all of the rules, regulations, ways that it's like a cult, her specific experience within it, and the ways that the church really let her down in a really big way. So thank you so much for joining us, Kathy Durbin.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So we have a lot to cover, and while I was watching Let Us Pray, the whole time I was like, oh my gosh, I want to talk to her, because your story, it's devastating, and I'm so happy that you've been willing to speak out and do the hard things, and really, I think it's helped a lot of people. I'm sure you've gotten a lot of messages. How's the feedback been since it released?
It's been amazing, but also heartbreaking that there's so many of the same stories out there.
Right. So other survivors are coming forward and sharing their stories with you?
Yes, lots and lots of people, both men and women, but a majority of them are women, coming forward and just saying that my story resonated with them in one way or another because of their situation they were in. Now that I have my voice and I own my story, I want to use it to help people in any way that I can.
Yeah, that's really amazing and inspirational. And I just can't thank you enough, because I know it can be difficult. Some people we've had on, Amanda, and she said it's healing to tell her story. Other times it can be hard to tell your story. As a survivor myself, I can understand the difficulty. So either way, we're very, very happy to have you here. So I guess we could just start by giving those who aren't familiar, and myself, because I'm also fairly new to the IFB church, a little bit of the basics of what the church teaches, maybe the modesty rules, and kind of their basic principles.
Sure. So Independent Fundamental Baptist is like any fundamental religion. It's the extreme version of it. So Fundamentalist Mormons are the extreme version of the Mormons. Fundamentalist Baptists are the extreme version of the Baptist. Growing up there, you have strict rules that you have to abide by. Your dress is probably the biggest thing. Women wear skirts and dresses below their knees. They can't have a slit in them because they think that points directly to your butt or up your thigh or wherever the slit is. They can't be tight, so they can't cup under your butt. Your top has to be 3 inches or 2 inches from your sternal notch, which is the little hole that you can feel by your sternum. So 2 fingers below that. If it's any lower, you're in trouble. You can't wear tank tops. You have to have some kind of sleeve. So literally your arms, your feet, and your face are pretty much what's uncovered. So that's like the huge one for women and girls, is dress. It's all about modesty. They don't teach sex education. Most of these churches have their own private school, K through 12 school, and they teach modesty. It's all about modesty and purity. They don't teach anything about your body, anything about sex education. You only listen to church type music. So hymns are huge. That's what you sing in every church sermon, church service. No worship music of any kind. Piano or like acoustic guitar is pretty much it. You can't have drums, nothing with a beat. That's from the devil. So you can't watch TV, you can't watch movies or anything. Pretty much anything that's in the world.
Right, the worldly things, right?
Yes.
That's what they call it.
You can't go to the movies. That's a total sin. So yeah, you're so isolated and everything is at church. And so one of the biggest things there, I think, is this patriarchal system. The men are the head of the household. The man of God, who is the pastor, is the head of everybody. The men in the church won't question him, let alone the women. I mean, like, nobody questions this man of God. And if, let's say, most churches, IFB churches, have 12 deacons that are really supposed to be responsible for making all the decisions of the church. So the pastor would hold a deacons meeting, these 12 men that have been like voted in as deacons. The pastor might say, okay, we need money for this project. And then the deacons would have to vote whether that's what the money is going to be used for, or where the money is going to come from, or whatever. But when these pastors get so big and they have such a big following, some of these deacons would push back a little and say, I don't think we should do that. That doesn't seem like something that we should use the money for, or whatever. They are then used as a sermon illustration in the next sermon. And sometimes he would call them out by name and he would say, you should never challenge the man of God. And he would quote the Bible verse, touch not the anointed man of God, that God is going to punish you for going against the man of God. It's so fascinating to me that being outside of it, how much of a cult it is and how manipulative our pastor was, but you just don't see it. You don't see it because you're so deep in it. It's crazy.
Yeah, I have a couple questions. So within the IFB, I assume that there are obviously multiple congregations, but within those, they're kind of self-governed, right? There's no one person at the top who acts as a prophet, for example.
Yes and no. So there's a lot of controversy over the independent part because each church will say it's an independent church. It's in the name, right? Mm-hmm. Independent Fundamental Baptist. But they all run in the same circles. So they go to the exact same conferences. They send their people to the same colleges. There's strict Bible colleges. There's IFB colleges. So Jack Hyles in Indiana he took over a church, First Baptist Church, and he was the true, first leader of the IFB. And he made it so big. His church was over 100,000 members at one point in
wow.
Hammond, Indiana. And he started a Bible college. And these churches from all over the United States and some other countries would send their young people to his Bible college. And then those preacher boys would go out and start churches or go be missionaries. They all came back to that church for all the conferences, youth conference, pastor school in the spring, ladies conferences. And they all sent their teenagers that were graduating high school to that Bible college. So they can say they're independent, but they all run in the same circles. And when, let's say, the whole thing with the pedophile shuffle, if our church has somebody that is caught doing something wrong, they will just move them to one of these other IFB churches.
Jeez.
So how can you say you're independent when you do all of these things together?
Yeah, it's a network.
Yeah. And when there's no real exchange of money, so there's not like the Catholic Church where all these different dioceses are sending money to certain bigger Catholic church, but they all support each other in some way. And so they're really not independent, but they claim to be independent.
Yeah, what's interesting, and we talk about obviously different cults and their cult leaders, it seems like there's the mega cult leader, which is Hyles, and then all of these smaller cult leaders who are essentially stepping in as a prophet figure, if they're saying never question me because I'm a man of God,
Right.
it feels like they're stepping into the role of a prophet within this umbrella of the major church. Is that true?
Yes, but they don't call themselves prophets. They're just men of God, anointed men of God. They've been called by God to be this pastor, and then they become untouchable because God anointed them to do
Okay.
this job. So you can't question them. They have all the authority, and it just breeds this whole it's a cult. Like, it's crazy to me. I truly believe there are independent fundamental Baptist churches that are not cults, but the majority of them are.
Right.
And the ones that are not have fallen away from some of these harsh rules that don't really fit our society. And so you can tell which ones really are and which ones are not.
Mm-hmm.
It's this whole abuse thing that's come up. It's so widespread within the IFB, and it's so considered somewhat normal in how they handle sexual abuse of minors that you can't say they're not connected. I even wonder, I went to Bible college. I went to Hyles-Anderson College. That's the college that Jack Hyles started. I wonder if the guys there were not taught how to handle sexual abuse that came up
Mm-hmm.
or child abuse that came up, because they all handle it the same.
Yeah.
So how can they all just freely make that choice? It's got to be within that teachings somewhere.
Yes. And that's a really good point. And I'm glad you brought that up because, of course, there's going to be variance. There's going to be gradients of the way people follow the rules or choose to follow the rules. And that's why you get a lot of people saying, well, not our church, or our church is different. And I love that you pointed out, right, but if you were following all of the principles and the rules, it wouldn't be different. You would be just like the other ones. And so I think it's important to note that just because a church is maybe a little bit more progressive in the way that they do things, it doesn't mean that they're completely separate, or it means that, yes, maybe you're more progressive, but you have to be able to also acknowledge the ones who were doing it the way that things were laid out initially, and those are the ones with the problem. So I guess two things can be true at once. Somebody can be more progressive about it and not have all of the abuse, and at the same time, they need to recognize that the ones that are following it to a T, there are patterns of abuse. And it seems like the ones, it's always the same within the cults that we uncover on this channel. The more strict they are with their purity culture, with their rules, the more abusive they are. Because people often say, well, abuse can happen anywhere. Yes, and it does. It does happen everywhere, unfortunately. But we see it the most in these groups who have these intense, extreme rules. Would you agree?
I would totally agree with that. Sarah Smith, that did the investigative report, she did a series of 3, I believe. She found over 400 cases in over 200 IFB churches.
Mm-hmm.
That is a pattern. That's not, there's a bad person in this church and a bad person. That is a pattern. And honestly, I can't think of more than a handful of times. And keep in mind, we went to church 3 days a week. So we went Sunday morning, we went to Sunday school, and then big church, what we called it. And then we went to night church service on Sunday. And then we went Sunday night. And then we were in the Christian school. So we were there Monday through Friday for school. And then we went soul winning on Thursday nights. We went bus calling on Saturday mornings, and we usually had a teen activity on either Friday night or Saturday night. So we literally lived at this church.
Mm-hmm.
And I cannot think of more than a handful of sermons that I've heard from that church that did not mention sex or a woman's body or a man thinking wrong because of the way you're dressed or the way you sit or the way you talk or the way you act. I mean, there was so much emphasis placed on women and their bodies, and sex was talked about, not necessarily sex, but like making the guys think wrong, but because of the way you're dressed or whatever. It was brought up so much that had to be all the guys were thinking about was sex, like all the time. And it, to me, that's like, I look back and think, how did I not notice? How did I not notice that we were blamed for everything? To me, if you believe in Christianity or you believe in the Bible, everybody sins. You have men and you have women, they all sin, but women are the only ones made responsible for making men sin.
Mm-hmm.
And then Eve's blamed for Adam eating the apple. You know, like the whole thing goes back all the way to there, that women are blamed. And they take that and they preach about that. In the story of David and Bathsheba, she's bathing on her balcony and he rapes her. She's blamed
For taking
for
a bath.
bathing on the balcony. But nobody says whether that was standard practice to have your bath be on the balcony. Like, it's crazy to me how much emphasis is placed on women to make men not sin. Like, it's our responsibility.
Mm-hmm.
I think that to me was like, the pressure was unreal. As a teenage girl, you're trying to figure out who you are and you're trying to like do the right thing and do what everybody wants you to do and respect your adults and be obedient. And then you also have to make sure you're not making a guy sin. Like, it's crazy.
It's way too much pressure to put on anybody, and they do it with shame.
Yes.
So even if you wanted to wear a shirt with no sleeves, so we couldn't wear sleeves either in the Mormon church. It had to be cap sleeves. In our schools in Utah, we would get in trouble, and I called it the shame shirt. Like, if you got called in for modesty, you would put on this like 4XL school t-shirt and everyone knew that you were wearing something immodest. And that's why we have a shirt on our merch that says the no shame shirt, and it's a crop top.
Oh my gosh, that's hilarious.
But it's this shame that they put on a woman's body, which is also incredibly harmful when it comes to, by the time you do get married and you're supposed to just flip a switch and have sex now,
yes,
you have this complex around your body because you've been told it's wrong your whole life. And there's so much harm.
Yeah, and you're also, the responsibility of pleasing your husband
Right.
is put on you, right? So you know, on the wedding night, you're going to have sex and you better perform, because if he ever cheats on you, that's on you too. You held out, you didn't give him enough, you didn't do it enough times a week, you weren't provocative enough. So you're like strict, modest, don't do anything, cover everything, to you're supposed to be a slut in the bedroom.
Yeah.
Like, it's so bizarre.
Yeah, how do you even navigate all of that? And I know a big part of your story has to do with victim blaming and shaming, which I was screaming at the TV with some of the things that you were talking about. I was like, are you kidding me? And I was even telling Jonathan on the way over here, and he's like, I'm sorry, what? Which I'm going to let you tell your own story, but I think it's important to emphasize how the victim blaming goes hand in hand with the shaming, goes hand in hand with the purity culture, goes hand in hand with this obsession around sex. And someone said this to me once. They're like, Mormonism is a sex cult. And at first I was like, that doesn't make any sense. But then the more I thought about it, the more I was like, wait a second, it kind of is, because it's all about sex, even though they say it's not.
Yeah.
They're like,
yes,
no, don't have sex, but the focus is sex, like you were just saying,
yes,
and it all
yes,
resonated, where I'm like, the more you talk about it, it's just, we're sitting in a room talking about sex. It's like, why are we here? Why are we talking about this?
You're sitting in a church service
Yes.
hearing about sex.
Yes.
It's crazy.
The emphasis is so extreme that how can you expect someone not to have all these distorted behaviors and abusive behaviors, because it's coming out in weird ways instead of healthy ways?
Yeah, I think like there's so many controversial things that they talk about. One of the things that our pastor would preach on heavily is money. Give it all to God. You don't need that. Your kids don't need braces. God gave them those teeth. You don't need that extra car. Your wife stays at home. Turn those keys in, put them in the offering plate. Your wife doesn't need a big diamond on her finger. She just needs a basic ring. Put it in the offering plate. I can't even tell you how many give it all sermons and fundraisers they had. We've built a church probably 3 or 4 times as far as money goes, and it's still just a concrete pad at that church. It was the church I grew up in is Faith Baptist Church in Wildemar, and it's still there to this day. And the pastor, who's Bruce Goddard, started the church in 1982, and he is still the pastor today. He would preach heavily on, oh, no man anything. You're not supposed to owe anything to anyone. You're not supposed to be a debtor to someone. You're supposed to pay your bills, pay them on time. God will provide, blah, blah, blah. And if you look up their property, they have a tax lien from not paying their federal taxes on their house that they own right now. And I'm just like, how hypocritical.
Yes.
And come to find out, he makes like $250,000 a year while he is preaching to the congregation
to give it away,
that you should give it all to God. If your faith should be strong enough to give everything, your whole paycheck, to God. Let's see how God provides for you. Mm-hmm. And people would do it. People would sacrifice and do it and say, okay, I'm not going to pay my taxes. I'm going to give that tax refund to the church, or I'm going to give that college fund for my kid to the church, and God's going to provide, while the pastor was making $250,000 a year.
Jeez.
If people actually knew that would blow their mind. I don't think that he would even have a church if people actually knew that.
Mm-hmm.
That's crazy to me. There's so many like controversial things like that I have found out since I left, preaching heavily on one thing while doing something else. It's just so crazy to me. It's strange how it's a cult. You're in it. You don't feel like it's a cult. You defend it because you're like, no, it's the Bible. The Bible says that. But it's all just twisted scripture. It's scripture that they put their own spin on and then use it to get the action they want you to do.
Yeah.
So I have realized we were heavily forced to memorize scripture. I can quote books of the Bible. But what I realized is some of the verses that we were taught, we only learned half the verse. And it meant one thing. The pastor told us what it meant. But now when you read the whole verse, like, that's not what they're talking about.
Yep. Cherry picking.
Yes. You don't even, it's like they use the Bible against you. It's crazy.
Yeah. So I want to know then about your childhood and how you interpreted all of this, because did you notice that you were a little bit isolated from the world? Were you even injected into the quote worldly things at all to see what you were missing? What's going through your mind as a kid?
My mom was married for the third time. So it was my mom and me and my sister. And my mom had gotten married for the third time to my stepdad, who she's still married to. And he had one son that lived at home, and he was an alcoholic, my stepdad. And so when we moved to Wildomar, which is where this church was, someone knocked on our door and we were invited to go there. I believe I was around 11. I don't really remember exactly how old I was. I wasn't quite into the youth group yet. So that to me means I was a little bit younger. So yes, we had lived like normal lives. We wore pants. We went to the movies. My stepdad was an alcoholic. We had family. We went on vacations. Like we did all the normal things. But once you start going to the church, and we didn't like jump in and start going to school there. The church didn't even have a school until I was in the 8th or 9th grade. So when we first started going there, we went to a different Christian school in town that didn't have a ton of rules. It was like all the kids that got kicked out of public school went there. And then a few people that they didn't want their kids to go to public school went there. But it wasn't really affiliated with any church. And so we would go there during the week and we'd go to church on Sunday morning. We eventually started going Sunday night, Wednesday night. And if you go to an IFB church, Sunday morning is really for visitors. So it's God loves you, the plan of salvation. Like, we are happy to see you. We're so glad you visited. And Sunday night is the hard preaching about how you should show up to church and give God the best, and you should show up in the proper clothes, and you should have a happy look on your face so visitors come and they see something that you have that they want, that, your life is great and your kids are happy.
Wow, they're teaching you how to indoctrinate people.
Yes, but all you're getting out of it is, oh, I got to give God my best. I should look happy at church. I shouldn't put my problems onto other people. And yeah, my kids need to behave. And oh, you have to be quiet. And you don't hear it like you're being sucked into a cult.
Yeah.
You hear it like you're you should do all this because it's pleasing to God,
Sure.
because God, you're going to find favor in God. But in reality, you're just being fake. I know families that would fight all the way to church, get to the parking lot, and the dad would be like, you guys get out with a smile on your face and don't you say a word. And like they would get out and be like,
Yes. My mom talks about that exact same thing.
now being an adult and being out, I realize everybody's fake. Everybody has problems, but
Yeah.
they're all at church thinking you can point to families and go, oh, I wish I had their parents, or, oh, I wish I was their kid, or, like, oh, their marriage is so great. No, none of them. They all have problems, but you don't know it by the way they act at church.
Exactly.
And it's just so fake. It's
Mhm.
so fake.
So when you switched over into this church at around 11 years old, I'm sure that was quite an adjustment. Were you forced to get rid of all of your pants right away, throw out the TV, all of that?
No, so it was a very slow kind of indoctrination.
Okay.
You start coming, you feel very welcomed, because one of the things they preach on Sunday night and Wednesday night is that you should be greeting all these visitors. They should have 10 or 15 people coming up to them saying, hi, I'm so glad you're here. And then it makes people feel welcomed.
Mhm.
And you always want to go to where you're welcomed. And so it's a slower progression. In the youth group, we had a very, very active youth group, like a big active youth group. One of the things that Bruce Goddard believed in was making church fun.
Mm.
He wanted the kids at church to have just as much fun at church as you would have anywhere else, so that you would want to be in church. So in a way, he was indoctrinating the kids
Mhm.
in that way, by making it so fun. But we had a great youth group. I have fond memories of stuff we did as a youth group, but there was such hard preaching all the time that you wanted to give up your pants. They would have music burning nights where they would have a teen night. Saturday night, everyone's going to bring their CDs and their whatever. Then it was tapes, and we're going to burn all the devil's music, and we would have a big bonfire, and people would chuck their stuff in there, books, music, whatever it was. They would do that usually once or twice a year. And of course, you want to do what everybody else is doing.
Mhm.
You want to be right with God. And so you do it. It's almost peer pressure,
Mhm.
because you have these teenagers whose parents are part of the staff and they're living this way all the time. And then you're being pressured in this group to live for God like everybody else. And so they kind of use peer pressure in their favor in that way.
Oh, yeah. It was the same for Mormonism, too. We would have girls' camps, and we're all getting around and doing the testimony meeting. I don't know if you probably had something similar where people stand up and say, I want to bear my testimony. I know this church is true. And they start crying, and everyone's crying. And then you feel like, oh, I should get up. And they tell you that's the spirit prompting you to get up
Yep.
and share your message. When in reality, you're just like, if I don't, they're going to think I'm not spiritual enough. And then so you feel forced to get up and make something up, and everyone's crying, and it's just like this whole spiritual manipulation circle, or group therapy, really. I mean, pick your poison.
Yeah, it was very much like that. A lot of teen activities were like that, because even at a teen activity, which you would expect to be playing some kind of game or having fun, they would still do preaching,
Mhm.
and they would still have an altar call, like where you would come kneel at the altar and pray, or give up something, or commit your life to God, or, whatever. But you don't want to be the only one in this group of teenagers that are pouring their lives out and saying like, I dedicate my life to God. I've been called to preach, or whatever. And you don't want to be the only one sitting there not making a decision. So
Right.
yeah, a lot of it was like just peer pressure to do it.
Yeah. So in those early teen years, did you feel like you wanted to become a preacher? Were you feeling that call?
No, women in the IFB cannot be pastors.
Oh, right.
The
Of course.
only
What
thing
was
you
I
can
thinking?
do, I know, the only thing you can do is like teach a Sunday school class. And you can't, I
Okay.
mean, that goes through like high school. You can't teach an adult Sunday school class. You might be able to teach a ladies group,
Oh.
but women are not allowed to teach men or to preach in the
Okay.
IFB.
Well, yeah, that makes sense. Having heard all of the patriarchal rules, and then I'm like, so say the opposite. So within that, how are you feeling as far as I'm sure they're preaching becoming a mother is your number one priority or becoming a wife? Was that something that was really on your mind?
So that is your only option growing up. You are supposed to be a wife and a mother. You're supposed to go to Bible college, marry a preacher boy, and support his ministry, whether that's him running a Christian school, starting a church, going and working as a youth pastor. That was your lot in life. There were no other options. There was no being a nurse, being a doctor, being a lawyer, that just wasn't even on my radar. I had this conversation the other day with my daughter and she was like, well, what'd you want to be? And I'm like, a wife and a mother, literally, because that's the only option we had.
Mm-hmm.
And now I look back and think, man, I had so many options, but I didn't know about any of them. So we slowly started getting into the church. And as you go to more teen activities and you have more friends in the youth group, I can look back now that I'm out and realize how you slowly get separated. And so you're going to these activities, you're making friends at church, you want to go because it's fun there. So even if like, let's say Wednesday night rolls around and your parents are like, we worked all day, we don't want to go. And we're like, come on, we want to go. Can we go? And so like, you're all wanting to go. You're dragging your parents there Sunday morning. They're dragging you there. And so you're all going. And then, you're slowly giving stuff up or changing your lifestyle. I remember distinctly right around November, early November, the pastor would start talking about holidays are coming up and your kids are involved in the church and the youth group and you should come to church because he always preached on coming to church 3 times a week. You should, if the doors are open, God expects you to be here, you should be here. And so I remember him talking about how, I know you guys have extended families, aunts, uncles, cousins that don't go to church and, maybe Uncle Bob drinks or maybe Aunt so-and-so cusses like a sailor. Like, do you really want your kids to be around that kind of behavior? Don't feel the pressure of your family to go see them just because you're their family. If they're going to influence your kids in a bad way, you should not have them around them. And he would start preaching that and bringing it up quite a bit around the holidays when people would normally go see their extended family. And I can see over my life in my teenage years in that church, how we slowly drifted away from our extended family.
Right.
Because if an aunt was having a birthday, we went. If a cousin was having a birthday, even if it was Northern California, like hours and hours away, we would go. We always had a yearly family Christmas party and like there would be 50, 60 people there because everybody came and we slowly started, well, it's just so-and-so's birthday and there's this church activity we should go to, or it's on a Sunday and we have to be in church because it's Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see where we slowly started being pulled away from our family.
Mm-hmm.
Once the school opened and we went to school there, so we were there literally 7 days a week. It was, your kids shouldn't play with the neighbors' kids if they're not in church. They're going to be a bad influence. They go to a public school and you don't know what they're taught. Why are you letting your kids go to their house? They need to play with their church friends. And so like, again, the pulling away, and before you know it, you have no one that you hang around or are friends with that doesn't go to that church.
Right.
A lot of the wives would eventually become stay-at-home moms because that was very much a thing that was taught. You should be at home with your children. The funny thing is your kids are at school 8 hours a day. So you're not at home with your kids.
Yeah.
You're at home. So like, wait, if I homeschool my kids, which they frowned upon that once the school opened, if you homeschooled your kids, you were frowned upon because they should be at the Christian school. And yet mothers should be home with their kids all day, but the homeschool moms were actually with their kids all day.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was so like, there's so much controversy in what they taught. But yeah, you can totally see over your time there how you got slowly pulled away from anyone else. And then now looking back, I can see why people don't leave. They don't leave because if you figure out that it's a cult and you want to leave, you are leaving everything. You're leaving your family if they go there. You're leaving your friends. You're leaving your school. Sometimes your job if you work for the church. I mean, you are leaving everything. It is so difficult to leave there.
Yeah, and that's why they call it a high control group or a coercive control group. If it's more comfortable than people calling it a cult, because I know some people squeamish with that word, but it's a high demand group where it is your entire life. It's not just somewhere you go on Sunday. It's not just something that's in the back of your mind. It is the forefront. Every decision that you make is based around a teaching. Every person that you interact with, at least the important ones, the ones who have influence on your life, they're all invested in the same teachings, and they will lead you in the direction of the teachings or the doctrine. And if you make a decision that would contradict the doctrine,
you're frozen.
You are shamed for it. Yeah, and you feel guilty afterwards. And if something goes wrong, well, it's because you make the wrong decision and you knew better, and this is your punishment for it. So everything is completely wrapped up in that, especially your identity. So I want to talk about your time at this specific school and how it kind of impacted and shaped your adolescence.
I want to say something really quick that you just alluded to was the fear-driven stuff.
Sure.
It was ridiculously fear-driven at this particular church. So tithing is a big thing, right? You're supposed to give 10% of your income to God. And
same with you guys? That's how it was with us.
Yes, that's a tithe, and that's before taxes are taken out. So, okay, but it goes further than that. They taught if you got a birthday present this week, how much did that cost? You should be giving a percentage of that. So if someone bought you a present that was $20, you should be putting $2 in the offering plate because 10% of all your increase.
What?
If someone bought you a coffee, you're supposed to give 10% of that. Okay. Yes. So, but again, this is a cult and it was all about him getting money and getting rich. So tithing, right? If you didn't tithe, he would literally preach, if you get in a car accident, well, that's God telling you you should have tithed. If your family member gets cancer, you should look and see where you're not serving God with your life, or you're not right with God, or not doing the things you're supposed to do because your family member got cancer. Like, it's extremely fear-driven to the extreme, I feel, like more than most IFB churches. If you weren't guilted into doing it or peer pressured into doing it, you were feared into doing it. Like, I don't want God to strike me down. I don't want, my grandma to die because I didn't go to church on Sunday and I went to her birthday party. Like, it's so fear driven. I was in the youth group. I was 13. They didn't have a school yet. And I had written a note to a teenage boy. Now, mind you, we went to this Christian school called Lake Elsinore Christian School. And it didn't have all the standards because it wasn't linked to any church. Again, it was a lot of dropout kids. And so we went to school there, and I wrote this teenage boy in our youth group a note that said I wanted to kiss him. Mm-hmm. And also during that time, I had tried to contact my real dad, because I did not get along with my mom. I never did. And so I had tried to contact my real dad, which he had given us up for adoption. And so we weren't allowed to see him or anything. He had given up his rights. And so I was trying to contact him. Looking back, I feel like I just didn't feel loved. I didn't feel like I had any kind of support system. I didn't feel like I mattered to anyone except my grandparents. And my mom would somewhat use them as kind of a bargaining chip. So, well, I'm not going to let you go to see grandma this weekend if you blah, 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 or whatever. And so I was kept somewhat at a distance from them. Like when my stepdad was drinking and being abusive, we weren't allowed to tell our grandparents anything. And they lived like less than a mile away from us. And so they were used somewhat, that relationship was used a little bit as a power tool. And so I just felt so alone. I had a stepdad, a third dad that was an alcoholic, And my mom and I did not get along. I knew she hated me since I was in the first grade, and I don't know why to this day.
Mm,
And so I just was craving love. I
yeah.
craved
Acceptance.
an adult caring that I existed, kind of. So anyway, I had at that time tried to reach out to my real dad. And so that was causing problems, I guess, between my mom and my stepdad. And then I wrote this note. And so my mom had gone to the pastor, and I went there. I had culottes on because if you didn't wear skirts, the only other option was culottes,
Hmm.
which most people could look up what culottes are, but they're basically, they look like a skirt, but they actually are more like huge baggy pants. There's
Hmm.
actually a split down the middle and there's two legs. But they looked like a skirt. And so I had culottes on. I literally had my Bible in my hand because she said we were going to church. And we went, and my mom had a conversation with the pastor. And the next thing I know, we're getting into the secretary's car. And my mom told me to get in the back, and I did. And we're driving down the road, and the doors like automatically locked. And I mean, this was in this was in 88. And so like doors didn't have like power windows and power locks, but they did lock. And I was like, whoa, like whatever. So we're driving and we're on the freeway, and I kept asking where we were going, and my mom would not say. And what was funny in a not funny way, like ironic way, is our youth group supported this girls' home, this IFB girls' home that was about an hour and a half from us. And we had gone there recently with the youth group, and we sat in these chairs and saw all these girls that were in this home, and our pastor preached, and then we left. That was one of our like youth activities. And then here we are driving up to it. And this girls' home is called Victory Christian Academy. It was in Ramona, California, and it was in an old FBI compound.
Oh.
And so there's this huge, like 15, 16-foot fence around it, barbed wire at the top.
Oh,
It like
geez.
literally had a fence that like automatically opens, the whole, you can hear the motor doing its thing, and then it closes, like you're going into a prison or something. Okay. So it opens, we drive in, and I'm like, why are we here? I'm still not figuring this out because I am doing everything in my power to be a good kid.
Yeah.
I'm not wearing pants. I'm not listening to bad music. I'm reading my Bible. I literally have my Bible in my hand. Like there's so many things, right? And I'm like, I don't understand why we're here. And we get there, and my mom's like, you're staying. And I'm like, what? What on earth could I have done? And it was that I had wrote this letter to this teenage boy that I wanted to kiss him. That's what she told them, is that I was being promiscuous or whatever at 13. Okay. Now, if my daughter at 13 came to me, or I found out she was trying to kiss a boy, I'd be like, okay, well, I know you like him and you think he's cute, but like you really shouldn't be kissing boys at 13, but like if I was as bad as she explained I would think I was being sexually abused, right? Why would a 13-year-old that doesn't watch TV, doesn't watch movies, goes to church all the time, why would I be thinking about kissing someone? You know what I mean? Like it doesn't make sense. Her excuse doesn't make sense. So I go into this girls' home, and I kind of know what it's about because I had just visited there with the youth group. We go in and we talk to Mr. Palmer. He was the owner of it. And then my mom leaves, and these two ladies take me in this bathroom, and they tell me to strip down naked. Now, we're taught nothing but modesty.
Right. That's exposing. I mean, to anybody.
Yes. Yes. And I'm like, what? And they're like, take your clothes off. You're going to take a shower. And I'm like, I just took a shower. And they're like, no, you're going to take a shower, because some of the girls that they would get there were fresh off the street. Like they were runaways. They had picked them up. They maybe had done drugs or whatever. And so they made everybody strip down, shower, and get new clothes on, even though what they called modest clothes, even though I came in modest clothes.
Mm-hmm.
So they were having chapel at the time. So after I got done showering and getting dressed, and they made me go sit in this sermon. And after the sermon was over, they assigned me a buddy. So you're assigned a buddy that you are pretty much attached at the hip for 3 months. And you are not allowed to talk unless spoken to by your buddy or by an adult. So you've instantly had your voice taken away. You are literally not allowed to talk. You will be in trouble if you talk. You can ask certain questions like where do I put my shoes, or where, like things you would need to know. You have to ask to go to the bathroom. You take a shower every day when it's your turn, but you get like 2 minutes and then they turn the water off. But what was weird is they had like toilet stalls and then shower stalls, right? With just curtains in between them. And so it's your turn to take a shower. You go in there, you undress. They say, okay, 2-minute timer. You turn on the water. You try to do everything in 2 minutes. And then all of a sudden you look down at the drain. If you have like one of the middle showers, and there's like, you can see blood flowing down to the drain, where some girl had taken a pink Dixie razor and tried to cut her wrist. Like that happened every once in a while. Someone would try to kill themselves there.
Oh my gosh.
Because it was horrible. On Saturdays, we had work days and we would work around the property. So some girls would work outside, but within the fence. And some girls were cleaning toilets, some were in the kitchen, whatever. They started building a new church auditorium, and we were doing the construction, the girls. And one Saturday, I had been placed in the Get Right room. It was a closet that had a bolted door on it, and then the walls and the floor were lined with indoor-outdoor carpet. And so there's nothing in there except for you're on this indoor-outdoor carpet and all the walls are indoor-outdoor carpet. There's one light like in the top, like just a light bulb. Any girl that was acting up or they felt was not behaving was placed in this room. It was called the Get Right room or the GR room. And I had this one lady that worked there. Her name was Virginia. She was Miss Virginia, and she was like the dorm mom, but she was like 22 or 23, in charge of 60 to 80 teenage girls.
Oh, geez.
Like she was on a power trip, and she has reached out to some girls and apologized. Like she looks back and sees how she, mistreated people. But she said I was rolling my eyes and having an attitude. And so she put me in the Get Right room, and I was in there for 3 days. They only open the door for you to get a meal, and it's like basic. It's usually like grits and eggs or whatever we're having. They would open the door. You weren't allowed to talk. They would give you your food. You would eat it, and then they would take your plate back and close the door, bolt lock it. And then the whole time you were in there, you were listening to very loud preaching tapes or music. And most of the time it was preaching tapes. Music was like, oh, thank God. Like I get to finally listen to Christian music or hymns or something, not somebody yelling at me that God's raining down hellfire on me or whatever. But that Saturday, I remember I was sitting there eating breakfast. The door was open because they would watch you eat. And I said, I feel like something bad is going to happen today. And she was like, you're not supposed to talk. I'm like, okay, so I'm eating. And then she closes the door. And then a couple hours later, she opens the door and she says, come on, we all have to have this meeting in the chapel or whatever. And so we go, and everything is kind of pushed to the side because it's Saturday, it's cleaning day. So the chairs aren't set up. All the tables are folded and everything. And we all just sit on the ground, and Brother Wagner, everybody's brother or Mrs. whatever. And so Brother Wagner gets up and he says, he's crying. And I'm like, what the heck is going on? I don't know how long for sure I'd been there, but it had been a few months. He gets up there and he said, well, she's dead. And I'm like, what? Who's dead? What is he talking about? And he's crying. Well, there was a girl there named Carrie Dunn, and she had been working in the construction that day. And supposedly some boards fell on her and crushed her head.
Oh my gosh.
And so, yeah. And so I'm just like, what? You go into this place, you're completely stripped down naked. So you're embarrassed. You're showered like you're some scum of the earth, like gross person. I mean, I had literally taken a shower that morning. You're placed in clothes that are not yours. And mine were way more modest than these things they were giving me. You're preached at like you're horrible. Like Mike Palmer would preach. He would literally, it talks about in the Bible how the goats and the sheep, and the goats are on the left and the sheep are on the right. And the sheep sit on the right hand of God. And he would pick you out one by one and tell you whether you're a goat or a sheep and make you go sit on whichever side he told you you were.
What?
I mean, like, it is so humiliating. You're completely stripped of any rights you have. I mean, you're not even allowed to speak unless spoken to. And then this girl dies after I'm sitting in the closet for I mean, you feel like you're in a movie, and it's the most bizarre, horrific experience. It's hard to even explain because it's hard to imagine that happens in America.
Yeah.
You're not in China. You're not in the Philippines. You're a teenage girl in America, and this is happening.
It sounds like a prison.
That's what it felt like, only worse, because at least in prison you can talk to people, you know, like you can watch TV, you know. They would make you write letters home twice a week, but they would black line, like Sharpie out things or make you rewrite it if it had enough stuff in it. Like if you said, oh my gosh, they're doing this and they're doing that and this happened to this girl, anything bad, they would mark it out. And then when you would get letters, there would be lines through it. And you're like trying really hard to read what it says because you're like, you just want anything that's not this girl's home. You couldn't have your first visitor until you'd been there 3 months. So 3 months with no contact except these letters that you didn't even get all of because they black lined everything. Mm-hmm. My first visitor was my mom. So she comes up, you have to sit through, it's a Sunday, you have to sit through a church service, and then you can have lunch with them. So we all sit with our parents, whoever has visitors, and we have lunch, and then you can walk around. So I wanted to walk around outside because I wanted to be outside. You could rarely be outside there. And so we're walking around outside, plus I didn't want anyone hearing. And I'm trying to tell my mom, this is happening and that's happening. And they did this to this girl and this to that girl. And she's like, Kathy, they already told us that you would lie and say stuff like that in order to make us want to take you home. And I'm like,
wow.
Oh my God, they have prepared our parents. Like, and so she didn't believe me, which I'm not a liar. I've never lied to her. I was like, what? How do you not believe me? But they literally prepare your parents that they're going to say this and they're going to say that. Don't believe them. They're just trying to manipulate you to take them home.
Oh, you must have felt like you were in a psych ward or something. I literally have nightmares about this.
I did. I felt like I was insane. I felt like this cannot be reality. Like that's how you feel. Like how in the world going to church all the time and trying to be good did I get here?
Yeah.
It makes no sense. And there was horrific abuse in there. There were girls tied to chairs and turned upside down.
What?
This one girl, she was pretty stocky. She was built like a linebacker. And Miss Virginia didn't think she was feminine enough. So she made her wear heels every day, all the time. She made her stand all the time. It's just so humiliated. You'd be called out for the simplest stuff and just... It was every sermon almost that Mike Palmer did. He would say, if you're getting demerits, you're not a Christian. If you're still getting in trouble here, you're not saved. You really didn't get saved. I must have got saved 20 times that year because I kept just begging God to like, save me. I asked like, why am I still getting in trouble? The whole program is a year to the day. So a year to the day at 8 a.m., your parents can pick you up. You eat breakfast with everyone, and then school starts, and then you go to the office because your parents are there. Me and this one other girl came in the same day a year before. And so her mom's there. I think her dad was there too. I don't remember for sure, but she gets to go home. And I'm sitting there on this bench outside Mike Palmer's office, and I'm waiting and waiting. And eventually they made me go sit in the schoolroom. And I was like, oh my God, my mom is not picking me up. She's leaving me here. I mean, I was doing everything in my power to make sure I was viewed as reformed so that I could go home. And my mom ended up coming several hours later. And she was taking my brother and my sister, my stepbrother and my sister to the airport because they were flying away to youth conference because it was in July. And I said, well, I want to go. And she's like, you're not going. And I'm like, okay, I've been in this freaking place for a year and I'm still in trouble. And I still don't know what I did to be here. So I just was like, oh my God. So I just went home and I tried very hard to toe the line. And I said, yes, ma'am. And anytime I would give her any kind of lip, like, well, why do I have to do that? Do you want to go back to the girls' home? And I would be like, oh my God, I didn't know what suicide was, but I knew if she ever tried to take me back there, I would jump out on the freeway or something. I knew I would be dead before I would go back there. About a year after I came home, the state finally shut it down. He didn't want to get licensed. And they said, if you don't get licensed, you have to shut it down. During the time I was there, there would be raids where they would put us on a bus, like a church bus with the windows blacked out. And we would be driven to some church. We would walk in. We wouldn't know where we were. We would walk into this big like auditorium or like a basketball court or something. And they would usually buy us like Burger King. We'd each get one little hamburger. And we'd be there for a few hours and we'd come back. We'd get on the bus. We'd go back to the girls' home and everything was flipped over. Everything was messed up. And it had been the state coming in to raid the place because they kept getting information that people were being hurt there and girls were, but somehow they always knew they were coming. And so they always got us out of there because they never wanted us to talk to the police or anyone.
That is just torturous. And so initially when you were talking about this school, I was thinking it was a boarding school or someone. No, this was a correctional facility, it seemed like.
Yeah.
There was a sentence of a year.
Yeah, it was definitely a sentence. So when I was in my 20s, I was trying to reconcile that being real, like everything I experienced being real. Like, I guess it was my form of trying to get closure. And so I went back there with a friend and I had heard that it had been sold to like some family that owns the property. And so I didn't know what it was going to look like or anything, but I thought, you know how like you're young and you're like second or third grade and you go to your friend's house and it's like 2 stories and you're like, oh my gosh, you live in a mansion.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, maybe, and then you go see it as an adult and you're like, that's just a little track home. What was I thinking? Yeah. Right. So I thought, well, maybe it was more exaggerated as 13, like maybe it wasn't as bad as I think it was. I think I need to see it. So I went back there and we drove up because it's down this dirt road and we drove up to the big fence. It was still there. And I was like, okay. And we went around the whole fence and I'm like, okay, I think I need to get inside. So we walk up to the gate. And some dogs start coming over and they're barking. And then I see this lady and a couple kids come over and she's like, hi. And I'm like, hi. I was a girl she goes, you came for closure. And I'm like,
oh my gosh.
I guess. She goes, yeah,
come on in.
There's been several girls over the years that have come up and wanted to look around. You can come in. And so I'm like, okay. And I thought, well, that's weird. And so I went in and everything looked exactly the same because they never got permits for anything. So they couldn't use anything. They could only use the one house that was on the property. So like she was trying to get information from me. Like, do you know what year this was built or whatever? I said, yeah, but we built it. So like, you're not going to have permits,
Yeah.
But it was weird. Like, what it did for me is walking around there and seeing the Get Right room. I was like, it was as bad as I remember it being. It was as bad. And I have a right to be angry.
Yeah.
And to me, that was what I needed. I needed to be justified in how I felt about it. And I think that really helped me. I don't think closure is like it goes away or it makes something better. I think your feelings about something are justified and that makes you feel better about it. So that was kind of my form of closure over the girls' home. But it was a lot.
Yes, that is a lot. And knowing where your story goes from here, just wow, there's so much that you had to deal with as a teenager. I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Yeah, it's surreal. It feels fake almost.
Right.
I was asked during the documentary, I forget what they asked exactly. It was something like, well, how do you feel about everything you went through or something like that? And I said, you know, honestly, I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't lived it all. I wouldn't believe one person can go through all this. I mean, if I hadn't actually lived it myself, it's a lot. And then people ask me like, how did you survive? How are you so normal? And I'm like, I have no freaking idea. One foot in front of the other. I say that I was always one decision away from being a drug addict or an alcoholic or a sex worker. You turn to something to numb your pain, right? To numb your trauma. And that's how these people end up homeless and drug addicts because they're just trying to numb something. And I think I could have been there. I could have very easily been there.
Looking back, do you think it's a possibility that you just dissociated and separated yourself from reality?
No, I think for me, and I'll tell you how I figured this out. I actually say it during the documentary. I don't know why. Something inherently in me wanted to be good and do good. And so I was constantly trying to do the right thing and prove that I was good. My parents could be proud of me. So that's what I always fought for. And so I just kept going on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, trying to prove that I was good. And at some point, I was good enough to be in this group of 6 girls that the pastor would take around to different states and different churches when he would go preach, and we would all sing. And like, you couldn't do that just as just some girl that goes to the church. You had to be viewed as one of the good girls. So I did attain that, at least in the eyes of the pastor at some point. But I also still felt very unloved and I just wanted someone to care that I existed. I don't know. I just felt like I didn't have that parental love that you should have, you know? The church started a school. We went there. It was when I got out of the girls' home, I basically went there, like to school. We ended up our church hired an assistant pastor, and he was supposed to come and help with the church, run the bus ministry, and help in the youth group. And that's what he did. And eventually he also became the principal of our Christian school. Every family in the IFB church, at least in our church, had pretty much one specific teenage girl that would always babysit for them. So if the church had like like a marriage retreat or a couples outing or something, they would come, that specific teenage girl would go to their house and watch their kids or whatever. And I became their babysitter. So their names were Paul and Lorraine Fox, and they had 2 little boys, and I would be their babysitter whenever there was a church activity that they were going to and the kids weren't going. And so like there was a few times I'd spend the night over at their house, and I just got really close to them. They ended up calling me the daughter they didn't have because they just had 2 boys, and I called them the parents I always wanted. He started buying me stuff. Like he bought me a dress and like different things. There's this Bible, a Thompson Chain Reference Bible, and it was like leather and super expensive, like $60 in the 90s. And he bought me one for my birthday. And so I'm getting these gifts from them, and I love them. And they're like the parents I always wanted and I wish I had. And we're just getting really close. Another thing is like in that church, you don't drive with a member of the opposite sex. You're never alone with the opposite sex. You can't even drive in a vehicle, a man and a woman, if they're not married. And so to each other. And so usually after a youth activity, he would drive around dropping teenagers off at home, the kids whose parents didn't come or whatever. And so it's, like an hour or 2 drive, dropping all these teenagers off. And a lot of times I would go with him, and then he would drop me off last. And so a lot of times we would be talking or whatever, and people saw us together. People saw us in the van together. And there was this rule, but there was also like this understanding that I was close to them, and people knew that. And so like, almost like, oh, well, it's Kathy that's with them. And so we ended up talking for long periods of time. And then he would drive me after school up to this place called the Santa Rosa Plateau. And we would talk or just go on a walk and talk or whatever. And I remember the teenagers went to went to winter camp. I think it was winter camp, might have been summer camp. And one of my friends in the youth group, she brought this teddy bear, but we're teenagers, right? We're 15. And I said, why do you bring that bear everywhere? And I was kind of making fun of her. Like, why do you bring a teddy bear? You're like 15 years old. And she had brought it to my house when she spent the night one time. And so I was like, why do you bring that? And she's like, oh, my dad gave it to me. And it was like she stabbed me in the heart. I felt like, oh, I'll never have something my dad gave me. I was heartbroken. And so I told him this story. I told him, like, I just felt so bad. Like, I'll never have that. And so here I poured my heart out to him and told him how bad it made me feel that I'll just never have that. And it was probably a week later or so, maybe a couple weeks. I don't know. I'm thinking it was like a week after school. A lot of times what he would have me do is walk down to the end of the buses. The school was here, the church was here, and then all the buses were parked here. And it was like maybe 3 acres or so the church owned. And so he would have me walk down to the end of the buses and pick me up so no one would see me get in his car alone. And so I got in the back seat and he goes, hey, I got you something. And I'm like, what? And he goes, look down at your feet. And there was this Kmart bag. And so I look down, I open the bag, and I pull out this teddy bear. And I hugged it. And I was like a 5-year-old little girl whose dad had just given her a teddy bear. I'm hugging this thing and I'm like so happy. Like, I feel like I'm 5. It is like Christmas to me. It was the best feeling ever. And then he says, oh, there's something else in the bag. And I'm like, something else? Like, I am so excited. And I dig down into this bag and I pulled out the skimpiest pair of panties I had ever seen in my life. And I instantly put them back in there and I said, I think those are for your wife. He's like, no, they're for you, and I'm like, I'm so confused in this moment.
Right.
Like, I went from this little girl whose dad had just given her a teddy bear to that. And I'm so confused because he's married. I'm supposed to be modest. Like, what is happening? We're not taught sex. Like, I am so confused. And then he started to drive and it was like super quiet. And then we went and talked and whatever. And I just like act like it didn't happen. And then I don't remember how much later it was. Maybe a couple weeks, maybe the next week. I don't really know. But he took me again and I was in the church van because a lot of times he would take me in the church van and he would take the seats out except for the very back row. And it was a 15-passenger van. And we went up to the Santa Rosa Plateau and we're sitting there. And by this time, over that week or two period, he had hugged me quite a few times and it felt good. It felt good to get a hug by someone you thought loved you.
Mm-hmm.
He had given me a kiss on the cheek. Well, at this point, he gets in the back of the van and he takes off all of his clothes and he's sitting on the very back row. That's the only row of seats that's there. It's one long row. I'm sitting in the front passenger seat and he's back there and he's taken all of his clothes off. And I'm like, what is happening? And so then he says, come back here and sit by me. Well, this is my assistant pastor. You don't disobey. So with the IFB, if you even go, okay, that's disobedience. If you don't do it with a good attitude, you have disobeyed. If a staff member or a pastor tells you to go do something and you don't willingly do it with a smile, that is disobedience and you would be corrected.
Wow.
So I reluctantly get up and I go sit next to him and he's naked. And I'm like, what the? I didn't say that, but like, I'm like, what is going on? And he's talking to me. I cannot tell you what he said. I have no recollection. It's like time is gone.
Mm-hmm.
But the only part of that I remember is he said, you can touch it. And I remember thinking, I don't want to even look at that. I've never seen a man's penis before.
I was just going to say, was this the first time that you've seen a man naked?
First time. He grabs my hand and he puts it on his penis.
Oh.
And I'm just like, oh my God, right? Like, I don't even know what's happening. And I don't remember if it was that day or like the next week. He was on top of me and we were having sex. And
Mm.
I never liked it. I never had an orgasm. It was never about me. It was always about him and the pleasure he got out of it. And he would just as quickly do it and get up and get dressed and tell me to get dressed, and that would be the end of it. Like there was no love involved. No, and it was so confusing because I am trying so hard to be this good girl that follows all the rules and obeys and does all the right things. And then there's this. And I
Mm-hmm.
want this father-daughter relationship because this is the only person that loves me or
Yeah.
cares that I even exist that's in my life on a consistent basis. But yet he wants this. And so it was so confusing. It was so confusing. It went on until I was 17. He took me to pastor school. No teenagers went to pastor school. There's this picture of this pastor school. Pastor school was in Indiana at the Mother Church, First Baptist Church, where Jack Hyles was. And every year around springtime, around spring break, they would have a pastor school. It was for pastors to come, get refreshed, hear some sermons, be preached at like they preach all the time, but also like anybody that works in your church. So Sunday school teacher, your staff, a Christian school teacher, any of those people could come, or any layman in the church that just worked on a bus route or whatever that wanted to come. And so a big group was going that year, and somehow I ended up going. He won a car that year. Our pastor won a car that year for bringing the most people the furthest away. And I don't remember how many people, but there's this picture with like, I don't know, it looks like 60 people standing up on the platform, but that's our group. And I am the only teenager in that group. And on several occasions, we would be sitting in a sermon. All of us, our whole group, this whole place is packed out. There's like, I think it sat like 2,500 people or 3,000 people were sitting there. And I was always sitting with him and his wife. And he would say, I'm going to go out, come out in 10 minutes. And I'm like, okay. And so he would go out. I would wait to what I thought was 10 minutes. And then I would go out and he would be waiting for me. And one time he took me to the van and raped me.
Mm.
And then one time while his wife was taking a nap at the hotel, he took me to this park somewhere and raped me in the back of the van. And then we would go right back into these sermons like
Oh
nothing
my
happened.
gosh.
And it's just so confusing.
Yeah.
But this went on until I had just turned 17. I turned 17 May 24th. And on June 3rd, my mom told me that the pastor wanted to talk to me, the main pastor, Pastor Goddard. And so I went to his office. It was after Wednesday night church. And so everybody had left. And I was like, what are we waiting for? Like, why aren't we leaving? And I remember specifically saying goodbye to his boys and saying goodbye to him. And then asking my mom why we weren't leaving. And she said, Pastor Goddard wants to talk to you. And so he eventually came out and said, okay, come in. And so I went into his office and we're sitting there. And by this time, it had been over a year. He was very cold and very just literally it was all about him. It was a little bit less about him in the beginning, but it had gotten more and more that way. And so I just felt like I didn't know how to make it end, but I wanted it to end. But I wasn't sure how to facilitate that, being that I'm supposed to be
Yeah.
obeying, but also I knew I was going to get blamed. I did not think I would get all of the blame, but I knew I would get blamed being the girl. And so I'm in his office with the pastor and he says, where were you last night? And I said, with Brother Fox. And I knew this was my moment. I knew this was my moment to tell him and just be done with this. And so I was going to seize this opportunity, but this is my pastor. How am I supposed to tell him this? Like, it was such a weird dynamic. It was this push and pull internally of, I want this to be done, but I have to tell him, but I don't want to
Yeah.
tell him,
So
but I need to tell him.
uncomfortable.
I mean, and he's like at first he's just like, so how was your day? How was school? Good, blah, blah, like no big deal. And so I know he has no idea what I'm going to tell him. And then the first thing he says is, where were you last night? And I said, with Brother Fox. And he goes, oh, you were at the Foxes? And I'm like, no. And he goes, but you were with Brother Fox? Something like that. And I said, yes. And he kind of waited, and it seemed like hours. It seemed like it took him hours to formulate a question, and it took me just as long to answer. I don't know how long this conversation took place, but it was long, but I don't think it was hours long. Oh, he said, "Where were you?" And I said, "Driving around." And he said, "What were you doing?" or something like that. And I didn't say anything. And he said, "Have you kissed?" I knew it was taking like too long to get this out. So when he said, "Have you kissed?" I said, "Oh, yeah." And I said it in that way so he would know we could get to the point, right? Because
Yeah.
I'm like, it's like taking forever. It's killing me. So he was like shocked, like taken aback. And then he asked me something. I don't remember. A lot of it's a blur. Then he went outside and told my mom to leave, that this was going to be a long night and like whatever. So he comes back in, he talks to me some more. I have no idea what we talked about. He made a bunch of phone calls. He called Jack Hiles. He called Christian Law Association, got some advice and was talking and stuff. And then he said, okay, after a couple of hours, he's coming in and out of his office. There's nobody there. Like it's a Wednesday night at like 11 o'clock. He says, "I'm going to go have you sit with Mrs. Goddard." Their house was on the church property. He said, "I'm going to have you sit with Mrs. Goddard and I'm going to go talk to your parents and the Foxes." And I said, okay.
And that's his wife, right?
Yes. And I knew I was in trouble. I didn't know how much trouble I was going to be in. But at this point, it was worth it. I felt relieved that he knew and it was out and it could be done. So I go up to the Goddard's house and he goes into the bedroom and he tells her whatever. She comes out in her bathrobe because I'm sure she was in bed. It was like 11 o'clock at night. And he goes, "Okay, you stay here with Mrs. Goddard." So he leaves. I sit down on the couch. She comes and sits across from me and she starts ripping into me. She calls me a whore. She says, "How could you ruin a marriage like that?" Like just saying all these horrible things to me. And I'm just bawling my eyes out. I am bawling. And I went from the biggest sense of relief to the biggest regret in my life within a moment. I was so relieved. And then instantly I thought, what have I done? Why did I say anything? She is just ripping me up one side, down the other. And I'm going, gosh, I knew I was going to be blamed for part of this. I had no idea I would be blamed for the entire thing. Like, I'm like blown away. That night, Goddard had a talk with Paul Fox. He admitted that we were having sex, and Goddard told him, "Well, if you leave, we'll rent you a U-Haul. If you leave within the next 24 to 48 hours, I won't call the authorities." And so he left the state and this whole cover-up began.
Did you know, looking back now, do you know if he was supposed to be a mandatory reporter?
He was supposed to be a mandated reporter. So this was 1992. And I think it was 1990 or 91, pastors were made mandatory reporters.
Okay.
But also in the IFB, this is another one of those ironies. They are very God and country. Like, so God, then country. Like they're pro-America, pro the flag, pro-service, like all that, but also fear government. Don't ever call the police. They can take your kids away. He told me that night, Pastor Goddard told me that night, I wasn't allowed to talk about it. And he said, "You don't want us to tell anyone because you don't want the Christians, if the police are involved, the Christian school would close. You'd lose your school. The bus ministry would be shut down. We could lose the whole church." And so you're like, well, no, I don't want that to happen. I love my school. I love being in the bus ministry. I don't want that, and that is put on you as the victim.
Wow.
That's your choice. And so, no, I didn't want anybody called. I mean, like, I don't want to lose everything. But now later, like as an adult, I'm like, wait, aren't I the church? if the church isn't the people in it, who's the church?
Right.
So who am I protecting if I'm not part of the church? Like, it didn't make sense. There's so much of it that just does not make sense.
None of it makes sense.
No.
None of that should have been on you. None of that was your fault. He should have been... The police should have been called immediately. He should have been prosecuted. And all he got was probably not even a slap on the wrist, but just go somewhere else and do... It's infuriating. And I'm trying to stay calm, Kathy. But it's so awful what they did to you and how they blamed you for it.
I just want to say, like, in that environment, it doesn't matter if you're 15, 10, or 5 years old, you are blamed. If you're a girl, you are blamed. 5-year-old girls sat wrong, spread their legs, didn't have their skirt down. It doesn't matter. They're blamed.
And that just goes back to the hypersexuality of the whole thing.
Yep.
Why are we sexualizing 5-year-olds? Why are we sexualizing 10-year-olds, 12-year-olds, even 15-year-olds? Like, there needs to be boundaries there. And the whole thing, the hypersexualization of the female body is where all of these issues stem from.
Yep. Absolutely.
Oh, okay. We've been talking already for about an hour and a half, and there's still so much to cover. I mean, obviously, there was a whole documentary on it. So
yes.
we need to come back and do a part 2 if you're okay with it.
Yep.
And leave the story here for now. Okay, because there's so much to cover, and I don't want to leave anything out or rush it. So awesome. I'm glad that you agree. So before we close out, let's get your Linda Listen moment, your sassy statement as the viral video with the toddler goes, or something inspirational.
Okay, so this would probably be at the end, but I'll say it now anyway.
Okay.
Linda, listen. You cannot heal from something you are not allowed to talk about. It doesn't mean you have to do it publicly. Go find someone you can share that deep, dark secret with. The more you talk about it, the more you can heal from it.
Yes, absolutely. That is so powerful. Bringing that to the light, bringing it out in the open. Even if it's just journaling, right? That's such a good start to get it out of yourself. And I feel like sometimes when you're able to write it down, you can look at it from a different perspective and you can really process it for the first time if you haven't yet. So love that. Such a good point. And is there anything that, maybe I should start with this. What can we look forward to in the next episode? A few things that we're going to be speaking on.
Well, we'll talk about how my brother-in-law gets looped into this story, and also how I got justice after 30 years, which is crazy in and of itself, and how I have a trial date coming up because I'm suing the church. So June 14th.
Oh my gosh, that's so exciting. Yes. Well, if people want to find you, I'm going to put all of the links in the description, but your Instagram is Montana Mom 4 and your Facebook under Kathy Durbin. Yes. And do you have any other final thoughts before we go?
Nope. It's a long, long journey. So come back and listen to part 2 because there's a whole bunch more story to go.
All right, perfect. Well, thank you again for coming on and sharing. You're a great storyteller. I was just like at the edge of my seat. Oh. Even though I watched the documentary and even knew some of the things that happened, I was like, and just wanting to hear it directly from you. It's been so great. So yeah, guys, if you're listening, if you can leave those words of encouragement, we love seeing those comments from you. If you can relate in any way, thank you so much for watching. If you want to support the podcast even further, you can get some of our merch at cultstoconsciousness.com under the merch tab. You can become a patron if you'd like to do that. Patreon.com/cultstoconsciousness. You can just come to Costa Rica with us. We have 6 spots left. It's going to be fun doing adventurous stuff, non-culty, I swear. and if you like this video, I'll leave 2 down here below that you can check out. And until next time, follow your highest excitement, be conscious and be well.